afternoon and welcome to the City Council work session for today, April 9th, and welcome back, everybody. I wanted to start out by saying we're going to have the work session item first, which is the sick leave ordinance, and then let's take about 45 minutes to pick out our committee reports and items of interest after that. So I'm going to start off right now with the sick leave ordinance. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll turn it over to Jason in our office to lead us through the conversation.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Councilors. My name is Jason Dedrick with the City Manager's Office. Here today to kind of revisit the sick leave ordinance. You last met on February 24th to discuss this, directed staff to look into this further. We have been doing research into this in the interim between then and now. Today what I want to talk about mostly with you is to present a timeline and a process for this, and to really get some feedback for staff around that so that we know that we're on the right track around timeline and the engagement with the community on this and stakeholders. So that's our big focus for today. If we're able to get that feedback and we have some time, we can talk about some other items. But for staff, that would be really helpful to get that feedback today. So I've got just a few slides, very brief presentation, and then I'll leave plenty of time for you to provide input to us. So again, our goals for today, that staff would really like to get some direction on the timeline for this project, and then some direction on the stakeholder engagement during that period. So what I wanted to do was quickly walk you through the process for this all the way from now through to if an ordinance is adopted to the actual implementation of this, so that you have a sense of the process that is in front of us and the work that needs to be done. So staff research, I mentioned that some of that's been undergoing already. We will continue that. That means looking into what other cities are doing, visiting with state and local entities that are helpful on these types of things, working with stakeholders. So all of the work, the normal work that goes into that. Identifying our available resources and having resource discussions. What we hope to do the next time we come back to you between now and then is to present you with some information on three different pieces. The first is wanting to understand the costs that may be involved with implementing and enforcing an ordinance such as this. So we want to be able to give you a good sense of the costs that would be involved there. So we're going to come back with that. Another resource that would likely be needed is some staff time. Again, if the ordinance is adopted, in order to implement and enforce and administer this kind of a program, it would take some staff resources. At this point, we're thinking maybe a half FTE. So we want to bring you more information on that. And then thirdly, we'd like to bring you some information on the impacts. That there may be some impact to the general fund because this ordinance would obviously pertain to city staff as well, and we do have temporary staff that would be impacted by this ordinance, and so we want to be able to paint a picture for you of any general fund impact that there may be. So those are three resource related things we want to come back to you with a little more information on. Stakeholder engagement, again, talking to those who would be impacted by this ordinance or those who are interested in providing feedback on it. That's certainly something we want to build into this process. Then obviously creating a draft ordinance and then having council take action on that. If your action were to be in the affirmative and that moved forward, we would then move into creating administrative rules. Doing some education and training. This has been a common theme through all the cities that have implemented an ordinance such as this, working with those that would be impacted, providing training, education for both employees and employers so that they will know what to expect when it becomes effective. There would need to be some work done to plan around and contract for implementation and enforcement. Different cities, different parts of the country have handled implementation and enforcement in different ways. So we would need to look into that, and if it were not to be the city, if it were to be an outside entity, going through the contract needs associated with that. And then, of course, implementation. So this process at the moment, and I'll talk a bit about the engagement piece here in a minute, but the general timeline is that we would hope that all of these pieces would occur, and again, if the ordinance moved forward, that we would be looking at an implementation date of January 1st of next year, of 2015. So these are the pieces that would need to occur over that time period. So a couple pieces to engage you on and get your feedback on around stakeholder engagement. A couple of core elements or time points in the process. The first is getting input on core program elements. So we want to make sure that we're hearing from those entities that would be impacted by the ordinance, understanding what we could do, what things we could build into it that would address some of the concerns or needs that are out there. So at this point, thinking about individual or small group meetings with businesses and other impacted parties. A second piece would be once we have a draft ordinance that is available to the public, between that draft ordinance publishing and the actual public hearing, staff being available to do information and outreach to the community so that they can provide informed testimony at the public hearing. So that's kind of a second piece of stakeholder engagement. And then a third would be if the ordinance is adopted, all the additional engagement around education, information, training need to be a part of any new ordinance. So really kind of three pieces there. I think for today we would really like to get your input on those first two. And then obviously if we move forward we can talk about the third one later. So the last slide that I have today is laying out a proposed timeline, just kind of week by week to give you a sense of what would need to be done in the timeline to do it in. Essentially, over the next 2 weeks, staff would work on stakeholder engagement, reaching out probably in one-on-one meetings or small group meetings with businesses and other interested parties, impacted parties, to get their input, chiefly around the notion of drafting an ordinance, because at the end of that 2-week period, we would need to have a draft of the ordinance to get to you. We would then be looking at the week of April 28th, scheduling a work session for April 30th, where you would have received a draft of the ordinance in advance. You could provide comments on that. Staff would then make any edits or changes to the ordinance and publish it to the public on May 2nd. There would then be a 2-week period where the public would, where we would work with the public on any questions or information that they needed around the ordinance. It would be their opportunity to review that, so there'd be all the outreach related with that. In advance of a public hearing that would be scheduled for May 19th, where folks could come and give testimony on the ordinance, and then scheduling a council meeting on May 27th to actually take action on the ordinance. If you work back from that May 27th meeting, the public hearing, the normal public hearing would be May 19th, and the draft ordinance would need to be published on May 2nd in order to provide the required time prior to that hearing. So that's what controls the timeline here over the next couple of weeks for that stakeholder engagement, is getting that done and getting a draft done in time to publish by May 2nd. So that's all that I have. Again, we'd really like to get your feedback on this timeline as well as the stakeholder engagement. If there are pieces of that engagement that are important to you, groups you want to make sure we talk with, or the way in which we talk with them, that will be helpful for us to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Very thorough. Thank you very much. I have in the queue Mike, Alan, Betty, and Claire. Mike. Oh, and George.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I think I first want to say that I admire and respect my colleagues that have brought this forward. And if my words are strong as I talk about this and describe it, please know it's not personal. It's just a discussion of ideas. And I'll go so far as to say as well, I know that your intentions are good with this. I know for a fact certain that your intent is to try and make our community better, and I appreciate that. It's just that I believe that this idea will cause our community and many, many people a great deal of pain, and it makes me very concerned. It's my opinion that I'll say it makes, in a perfect world, this would be the rule. Every company would offer something like this, but we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a real world, and in the real world, this is going to be damaging to our community. It frankly makes me kind of heartsick that this council would seriously consider an idea like this that is reckless and kind of monstrously bad idea. My concern here revolves around the fact that this will cost, in the real world, this will cost our community hundreds and hundreds of jobs. And in the real world, this will cost Eugene dozens of businesses. It will shrink our tax base, at a time when we can least afford it. And my concern is that it will cause us to have to make deeper cuts in important services that people in our community rely on as our tax base shrinks from businesses looking at this responsibility that they're being forced into and for whatever reason today feel they can't do and decide to move elsewhere. And I don't think that we can afford that kind of recklessness with our tax base. For those that would argue that it won't have those effects, I would ask you to please, through this process of staff work, do a better job measuring that, because there are many in leadership positions in our community, in our business community, who feel that it will. So I'd be willing to bet that there's probably even business owners in our community and business managers and people who work on behalf of larger companies who will tell you, we're going to have to let people go. We're going to close our Eugene office. We're going to move across the highway to Springfield. And while this has very good intentions as an idea, I think that the practical effects will hurt a great many people. And so I'm concerned that we go slowly and that we measure very carefully who intends to see those effects happen.
Alan?
So one of the things I'd like to incorporate into this is a panel discussion. We've done many panel discussions here at the council on different topics, especially if they're somewhat controversial, and we also want to have more input for the council to deliberate upon. So, and so using that model, I'd like to see a panel where we brought in both points of view, so maybe 2 people pro, 2 people con, and then a technical person that could address some of the issues around some of the technical issues associated with this. And I'd like to do that sooner than later. And I was initially thinking that might be a good thing to do on the work session on the 30th, which is 4 weeks away, so it's there's enough time to actually pull that together. And maybe if we had the draft ordinance that staff pulls together prior to that, it looks like this time frame could do that, then they could chew on that and discuss it in that panel as well. And then we could have a work session following that to actually massage and craft the language by council and then send it out to public review for a hearing, for a public hearing. So that might add actually another meeting to it, wouldn't it, Jason? So if we did that panel on the 30th, which I'd like to get staff's opinion whether that is doable, and then so we'd add another meeting in there between the April and May thing, I suspect. April and May public review of the draft ordinance to actually discuss that at council.
Do you have any response to the timing issue?
The only consideration if we were to, if we did a panel, let's say on April 30th, and then wanted to come back for another meeting in early May to finalize the draft, we would need to continue to provide that public comment, official comment period on the ordinance, or the lead time between publishing the ordinance and the hearing, which likely that would shorten it such that we couldn't do it at the May 19th hearing.
Right.
So we'd either add one or do it in June.
The June public hearing, which is okay with me. I don't think there's a rush to do this. I think it's still a good idea. And I think having the ordinance brought back, it was an interesting letter that we got from the U of O bookstore folks who have a bookstore up in Portland, and they're operating under this rule. And their comment wasn't to the merits of it, more that we should try to be consistent with what's going on in other places, and if this is going to be potentially be a state rule, as I firmly believe in bottom-up democracy where things bubble up, and the cities often are the generators of really good ideas that end up becoming state policy. Portland does it, Eugene does it, a couple other people do it, then we're going to end up with a state law because 90% of the state's already covered in it. That's one way to think about it. So I think that the ordinance that we draft should be really closely aligned with the Portland ordinance, That would be my desire.
Betty?
Thank you. I think the timeline is fine as it is, and I don't know whether we need a panel or not. I think we need public comment. But I'm concerned about what you say about stakeholders. I think you're thinking about businesses only, and the big stakeholders are most of the stakeholders would be workers. And I know that the people who don't currently have sick leave probably won't be willing to come out in public and say it, so it would have to be other people who represent their interests who would talk to us. But definitely we should know about the interests and the problems of the people who work, who are really the biggest stakeholders. I agree with Alan that it would be good to follow Portland's lead, probably. I haven't looked at that carefully, but I think that it makes sense. And I don't know whether the panel might just be a diversion or a postponement. So I have some concerns about that. Thank you.
Claire?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the work of staff and this outline. I think it's a good place to start. And it may be that we are able to give you enough direction that a stakeholder work session isn't necessary, but I also think there might be some value because it would allow council to do some Q&A with folks who come to give input on how an ordinance like this would look for Eugene. We've been hearing from folks, both pro and con, but have been hearing folks in support. I've been told an estimated 2,500 Eugene residents have signed on in support of the effort to pass this, and 45 local businesses have also affirmed their support for a local ordinance. And contrary to some of the fears that Councillor Clark expressed, there's some very solid evidence that cities that have adopted similar ordinances have actually seen positive impacts, whether that's because of the ordinance or not, it's not able to tell, but have not reported loss of jobs or businesses moving out of their city. So I think it's really important that we continue to hear from workers and employers here in Eugene about what they would want to see in a local ordinance and how we can address concerns they might have about implementation and how it works for them. We want to support employers who are already offering this protection, and we would want to craft something that would be easy for both employers and employees to understand and implement. So I think a stakeholder session with council, I would love it if we didn't have to extend the timeline in order to accommodate that. If there was a way to do that on the 30th, have a draft ordinance, have a discussion with council, and send something out from that date. And I might suggest, in terms of specifics, I very much appreciate what Councillor Taylor said about workers being some of the biggest stakeholders in this conversation. I think perhaps we might be able to invite a union representative. So even though we assume all unions have paid sick time, that's not necessarily the case, or it may not be in the format that this ordinance comes through, or how Portland's has been. So that might be one way to hear from workers' voices without putting a worker on the spot. Small businesses, I think, that are in support would be good to hear from, whether or not they already offer this, businesses who might have a concern. And in terms of technical support, we might look to BOLI, or we might look to the staff in Portland that was responsible for helping craft this and help with implementation, so we get some technical perspective on how that happened for them.
Rich Brown?
Thank you, Mayor. Great, thanks. That looks like a really good timeline. And I think it would probably be okay to have the panel and have an extra meeting, 2 extra meetings perhaps. You've provided us previously at the other work session with copies of the ordinances from Seattle and Portland. That was very useful. I read through both of those. And so I think that I would suggest following up with staff from both of those cities that that worked on it, and ask them, because I think that some of the same, I would imagine that the same concerns were voiced up in those cities about, this is going to be harmful for businesses, so, and they address those, I'm sure. And so maybe that would be one of the focuses. You go, well, what did you hear from business owners against this proposal, and how did you address their concerns, or attempt to address their concerns? Just get feedback, and then maybe get feedback. They're both fairly new in those cities, so they were enacted fairly recently. So, but I'm sure that they could give you some good feedback about implementation and ordinance and enforcement. Those were covered in both of the ordinances in quite detail in the one from Seattle, and not so much detail in the one from Portland. But so it'd be good to hear that, and also any research beyond Seattle and Portland. Other cities, and I don't know if it's being done at state levels anywhere.
It's only one state,
Vermont,
Connecticut.
Connecticut. Okay, maybe try to find some analysis of that program. What's been happening in Connecticut? I think there was a little bit for our last work session, but if that could be expanded on, so it'd be good to see all those things. And by the way, I think it's totally appropriate for cities to take the lead on this thing when there's gridlock at the national level and oftentimes at the state level. Sometimes the cities just have to go, well, we just can't wait anymore. We should get moving on this. And we've done that before, and in most cases it's totally appropriate. Thanks.
George Bowling.
Thank you. Well, it's my intention, I'm just going to let everybody know now, that as this moves forward, I'm going to advocate and continue to advocate that this ordinance be put out to the public for a vote. And if we're in such a rush to get it done by the end of May, I suggest that we put it on the November ballot. I myself think the timeline set out, we're rushing this, as complex as this is. We're looking at the almighty Portland for an example, and they're, 90 days into their sick leave ordinance. What kind of good quality information can you get from an ordinance that's been in existence for 90 days? I don't think there is any good information coming out just yet. Who are the real stakeholders in this? I think there's two distinct different stakeholders. Those that benefit from it, which are the workers, I'll agree with that. But I think the biggest burden will be the people that are ending up paying for it, primarily the small business owners. And I would suggest that if we involve any stakeholders, that you talk to the small business, involve small business owners, those that currently pay for sick leave and those that don't, as well as talk to somebody in a company that has to deal with the Portland ordinance that is based here in Eugene or in Springfield, that has to go up to Portland and do business and find out what a quagmire the paperwork is for them to figure out what to do on that. So that would be my suggestion as far as the stakeholder group. But I just think we're rushing this, and I think we need to take a little more time to study it and wait for some better quality information coming out from the almighty Portland before we move any farther.
Chris.
Thank you. I want to understand this issue as thoroughly as I can, because it's a classic collision between values. And it doesn't mean that one set of those values are better than the other. It's simply they don't happen to be compatible in some way. But I don't think that necessarily means we're incapable of reaching a solution or making those values able to work together. I think in terms of principle, I am actually intrigued and somewhat supportive of the idea of giving workers the opportunity to do this. But I don't want to do it in a way that at a practical level hurts business significantly. That's why I think our understanding is critical. And I want to take the time that it's necessary to fully understand what the practical implications are for this principle we want to go forward with. Government has been engaged with the business community for centuries. Workplace safety, child labor, minimum wage, those are all aspects of how government has indicated to business that they need to conform to certain requirements. But I don't think you should just do it as a whim. I think it needs to be very thoughtful and deliberate. So I am absolutely fine with the idea of government imposing requirements on business, but they need to be thoughtful and deliberate, and that's where I really think we need to take the time. Alan's proposal to have a forum or a panel kind of discussion, I think, is a great one. I think whatever information we can get that can help us to learn more about the implications of this, information from other cities, not just Portland, but there are other cities that have implemented this that we could find out information about so that we could know much more effectively what the implications of this are. If you're going to impose requirements on business, you want to do it thoughtfully, and you want to do it carefully and deliberately. And so I think we should continue to move forward with as much information as we can get, but make sure that we have the knowledge in place to be able to do this in a way that doesn't create unnecessary conflict between values. I think we can avoid a lot of it if we're just real thoughtful about it. So any proposals to take the time and to provide input from stakeholders, I'm fully supportive of. I think that's a good way to go.
Before we go to round two, the only comment I wanted to make is when I looked at the things that you were talking about looking at in terms of cost and staff time and impact, I think you have to do what we've learned in other places, which is sort of a full cost analysis, which really points out what you gain and what you lose at the same time, and tries to put some balance in how it's looked at in terms of the whole picture. So I really advocate for doing that. Alan.
I think this is a great case for a triple bottom line analysis that looks at the economics, the environment, and the social equity aspects of it. And because this is a complicated issue, and having it come from all three of those perspectives, this would be a primo example of where that tool could be extremely useful. It's not trying to equate all of those and make them all equal. It's trying to analyze what the impacts are. Just to be clear about why we use the triple bottom line. I guess I was unclear about what you were talking about, Jason, when you were talking about the staffing and a half FTE, and is that related to the study, enforcement, putting it together? Maybe you could be clearer about that.
It would be, I mean, at this point, that's just a guess. We hope to know a little bit more, over the coming weeks in discussions with Portland and Seattle and other cities about their staffing needs. Certainly, it would be, in terms of working up to the actual effective date, it would be working on any contracting that needs to be done with an entity, say like BOLI. It would be coordinating all the trainings or educational opportunities that would be needed. It would be working on the administrative rules. And then what's a little less certain is what happens after it's effective, the effective date, and the amount of staff time that might be needed at that point to continue to administer the program. So that's one that we don't know as much about, and even talking to, Portland, for example, won't help a lot because they're just 3 months in. So I think what we'll try to do is talk to those cities that have had something in place a little longer to try to understand what kind of staffing needs they've had.
Okay, that's good. Portland's not the primo example of this. Granted, Portland's only had it in place for several months, but Seattle's had it in place for a year and a half. San Francisco's had it in place for over 7 years. Washington, state of Connecticut, 2 years. So I think there's places to go that have much more experience about that. And I guess there's you often talk about best outcomes and worst fears, and people are expressing their worst fears, and I get that whole part. But I guess I caution people to go beyond fears and potential to what is known. For instance, when San Francisco did an audit of 3 years after implementation, 70% of employers reported no impact on profitability, 15% said they didn't know. 2/3 employers expressed support for the law after they were done with it. In Washington, D.C., they did an audit after they had implemented it over several years. And their report said no evidence that the law prompted businesses to leave the city or discourage employers from establishing new businesses in the city. Connecticut's study, when they look back at it, actually said it improved employee productivity and morale. And Seattle, so far, after their year and a half, no evidence that the law has had a negative impact at all on their economy. So I guess there's the fears, and then there's what people have actually learned. And I hope we keep that in front of us. And I understand people's concerns, and I want to hear more about what their concerns are and get more input about it, and maybe we can craft the ordinance to mitigate some of those legitimate concerns. So I think that's why I wanted to propose the panel. And then finally, Jason, you said you've done a bunch of staff research. Well, besides what you've said right now, what other things have you looked at? What cities have you looked at, and what other things have you learned? And we only got a one-pager as an AIS, so if you've done a lot of research, what is it that you can share with us?
I think some of the things that I could kind of share just off the cuff would be one of the things that's been of concern for us is the implementation piece and how different cities are doing that. Some of them do it internal to the city in terms of the training and implementation and enforcement. I believe Seattle, San Francisco do it that way. They do it out of the actual city government versus the way, for example, Portland has done it, contracting with BOLI. And so I think we're trying to get, we're doing some work talking with BOLI, talking with Portland about what they've learned from that and what might be a good template going forward, and researching how other cities have done that, particularly those that have chosen to bring it in-house within the city, and trying to determine what would be involved with that. So that's a little bit more on the implementation side. We have been looking at a lot of the information that you've cited coming out of other cities, trying to look at that data on what the impacts have been for those that have had it in place longer. I think one of the concerns I have is making sure that we're bringing forward information that's been well vetted and is good data, and so that's of concern for me from a staff standpoint. So a lot of the digging I'm doing around in data is try to make sure that I'm bringing you the best possible data that staff can bring you. So that's some of that work that's been done. And I think, I have been doing, I wouldn't call it necessarily, quote, staff research, but I've been doing my own kind of chatting with people in the community when I'm just out and about, kind of businesses that I frequent, employees there, and just chatting them up about this and the few business owners that I know. So that's informal research, but it's trying to get a pulse for what's out there. I think that a focus for our efforts, you will certainly hear a lot from interest in the community kind of in favor or not of this ordinance. I think in terms of staff research, we really want to try to bring forward information that is helpful in crafting an ordinance that addresses as many of those issues as possible. That's a good place for staff to be on something like this. And so when we're out engaging those parties that are impacted by this, I think it's less along the lines of where are you in support or not, and more along the lines of what can we do to craft an ordinance that would address your needs. So that's another piece of staff research and how we'll have already been and will continue to try to focus our time.
Yeah, I guess there's two impacts. There's impacts on workers and impacts on businesses. So, Mayor, on the end of the round.
Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to absolutely agree very strongly with my friend Alan and say that we should separate fears from facts here. When I voice my concern, I'm not operating from a place of fear when I talk about the potential impacts. I'm talking about facts. These will happen. One of the interesting things is who we gather truth and facts from. It often colors how we look at a particular idea or an ordinance. For example, I would consider someone who works in the banking industry, working with small business owners and helping them succeed, as a good place to get information about what businesses face and what they do. I was speaking this morning with a friend of mine who's a mid-level manager at a bank in Portland about the number of businesses they've seen leave the city of Portland over issues like this and this particular one, and his concern about it. I know that I can look around the room and see 4 or 5 business owners and managers in the room who are here today because they're concerned about this. I know it's a fact that the Chamber of Commerce, who if they represent the small business owner in our community, says 83% of those that they surveyed said absolutely no, they have great concerns and don't want us to do this. That's business owners of all different political stripes. And I have to say that I disagree pretty strongly with my friend Chris and to some degree George here. This is absolutely not a clash of values. All of us value the quality of life we have here and the impact on people who work for a living. I say this is a clash and a conflict between economic and political philosophies. It's not a clash of values. We all value living in a better way and living more effectively. But I believe that this kind of economic outlook and this particular type of policy will cause more pain and more harm to people that work for a living they'll lose their jobs, and our tax base will shrink. And because of it, we'll have to have more discussions about closing libraries and closing services that people depend on in our community. So again, I think I admonish staff to speak with as many people in our community who have concerns about this and who will speak them out loud and say, yeah, I mean, if the rule is it's businesses based in Eugene, I'll rent an office in Springfield for $200 and call that my headquarters so I don't have to face this. What will be the real decisions on the ground in the real world that people will make, and how will that affect us? There's good information to gather in Portland about what's happened so far, and there's good predictions we can make based on talking with the people who will actually make those decisions.
Claire.
So it's Public Health Week this week, and from my perspective, putting parameters and requiring certain standards for employment is an appropriate role for government when public health, safety, and welfare are concerned. And we do have businesses in this community who are offering this benefit and have found it to be financially feasible, and others who would like to offer this benefit but are concerned that if they do it without the backing of an ordinance, they are going to be at a disadvantage to their competitor next door who's not offering the benefit. So by passing an ordinance along these lines, we'll create a level playing field for businesses who want to provide the benefit. Sick workers, children going to school or daycare sick, have a real impact on the health of their coworkers and other children. Families in financial stress cannot afford to lose a day's pay, and thousands of workers right now in Eugene have zero protection against being fired for calling in sick or having to stay home to care for a sick child. Workers and businesses both will benefit when the estimated 25,000 workers in Eugene who don't have any of this security right now gain some added financial security that will allow them to spend more of their earnings in our local businesses. Employers will experience savings through greater worker productivity when whole worker units are wiped out for a week from making each other sick with the flu, and also reduced turnover. You know, some of my professional colleagues who I've spoken to about the fact that I've brought this forward to the council table are shocked when they find out that workers don't enjoy this basic protection in their workplace. And more shocked when they find out that many restaurant workers and food service workers do not enjoy this kind of protection. So I'm really viewing this as a public health issue. I do understand that there could be some economic impact, but I also think it will be spread across our entire city economy, and that it won't have the horrifying effect that we're hearing called out by some of the opponents. In terms of looking to the almighty Portland, the only reason that I am suggesting we look towards Portland is because we do have businesses who do business here in Eugene and in Portland, and again, trying to make this as easy as possible for those businesses should be something that we try to do. And also, Portland learned from the experience of other cities that had passed similar ordinances and learned from that experience in crafting theirs. So they have some experience. It's not because they're better than us or they're smarter than us or we should do everything Portland does. It's about learning from the experience of other cities so that we can have as robust and effective an ordinance here for Eugene workers and employers.
Okay, Alan.
I think this is similar to the minimum wage arguments that we hear. There's a lot of rhetoric and speculation about the impacts of minimum wage. And then recently there was a study that came out by I think it's Congressional Budget Office that actually said that raising the minimum wage actually creates jobs and is good for the economy, despite all the rhetoric. So you're going to get both sides of this, and hopefully we can kind of wade our way through all of it. I think it's a similar case here that I agree with Councilor Surratt. There may be some short-term economic impacts, but I think they'll be short-lived as we get used to it. Dare I say, people in Eugene actually do get used to things, and we have a good example in the reusable bag ordinance, where how many people hear about that now? Nobody. Just every once in a while, but hardly any. So I think things can actually get implemented here. I think that there are benefits to be had for businesses as well as impacts, so I think that hopefully people will think through that clearly. But bottom line is really, to me, it's a lot about quality of life. And some of the folks I've heard about things that why they're supportive of this. Kathleen, who happens to be Abby, who happens to be in my ward, said that she had to go to work when she had bronchitis and pneumonia to avoid being fired, and maybe made her colleagues sick. And Stephen said, I work in the elements which weakens my immune system. To make a decent living, I'm often forced to work through sickness as opposed to resting and getting better. John said, getting sick is the worst, and it's nice to know that it won't kill you financially if you have to stay home. Roseanne said, having worked on service jobs, I'm well aware of the pressure to have to continue to work even when I'm ill, and this puts others at risk in that situation. It's problematic, and one thing that can help us is paid sick days. And Kathleen said, I don't get paid on 6 days, and I end up going to work sick so I can pay my bills. I think that, I don't know how you crafted having Public Health Week happen to land on the day that we're having this conversation, but good for you, Claire. That's pretty amazing. But I do think it's also a public health issue. I don't want people who are serving me at restaurants coming to work if they're sick, and I'm sure that happens now. And also my colleagues at work. Unfortunately, I work at a place where we are afforded those kind of benefits, so that's not an issue at my particular work, but I'm sure it is around the city. The estimates are that half the workers in Eugene don't get earn sick leave, and that's a pretty big number.
So, yes, Betty.
I have one more thing that Alan reminded me of. Not only do people go to work sick and make other people sick, but they send their children to school sick because they can't afford to stay home with them. And then they infect all the other children, and people know that the disease is really spread among children and their teachers. I wanted to comment, too, on the statistics from the Chamber of Commerce. As I remember, I was just trying to look and find it on my email, but I didn't find it yet. But as I remember, a very small percentage of people responded to that survey. So when you talk about the percentage who said something, you need to consider the percentage of the people who were asked who responded. And I think it was very small.
George?
Thank you, Mayor. Well, about 15% of the membership responded, and then 85% of the 15% opposed the idea, so that works out to be 13% of membership. We know oppose 13%. Thank you.
So, Jason, is there something else you need from the council today?
I don't think I have anything.
I just want to make sure I clarify. There was conversation about a panel which would, what I heard Jason say, that the public hearing, if we did that, would probably get moved into June. So I just want to make sure if we're doing some of that, those kinds of things, I want to make sure that we understand that it'll probably move into June.
I heard Councilor Surratt say she wondered if some of those parts of that could be pushed together more tightly, so it wouldn't, so that it would, sorry, that knock is from me. I heard Councilor Surratt say that she was asking that you look at it in terms of whether parts of that could be squeezed together in different ways to move along the process more
Perhaps
expeditiously.
I can address that. If the council had a panel discussion on, what was it, April 30th, I think, it would not be possible if after that panel discussion you give direction as to what the ordinance should say, to get an ordinance drafted and under the charter requirement for publication and notice before a public hearing to actually have the public hearing on May 19th. So if we do the panel discussion and then you give direction, we'll need to postpone the public hearing from the May 19th date.
If you want to say something.
Sure. I think assuming we can put the panel together and it's not a huge burden, I think it would be worth having, and I think it would be worth extending for that little amount of time to do that. So that's my perspective.
Yes.
Would we have a draft ordinance that the panel could respond to by then?
I think we could do that, yes.
Yeah, okay, good.
Anything else?
I think that's important.
I haven't conferred with Jason. Right now, I'm not aware of any direction from the council on what that proposed ordinance would be, and so unless, and I wasn't at your last meeting, but unless Jason knows what that would be, I can get you a proposed ordinance, but it will have all of the policy assumptions that the City of Portland ordinance had as your proposed ordinance, because I wouldn't know what else to embed in that. So basically, I would take Portland's ordinance and I would turn it into Eugene's format and give that back to you as the proposal.
That seems reasonable. I mean, it's a starting point that we can work from.
And if there are any other good ideas that these other communities had, or state of Connecticut, Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, that might be incorporated, Jason can help you figure that out. That might be a good thing too. And maybe there's some options, kind of things that we can look at.
Certainly do that.
Okay.
All right. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good first discussion here, or second discussion. All right. Next part of the agenda are comments and things that the council wants to make. And I know Councilor Pryor has something he'd like to start out with.
Want to do that first?
Sure, you can do that.
I wanted to propose a motion to rescind the council's decision to designate the parking lot near Autzen Stadium, where the existing car camp is, as a rest stop. And if I get a second, I'll explain my reason why.
Moved and seconded.
I brought the original proposal to designate that site to the council before the break, and I was rushing to do it before break and before the closure of Whoville, and in doing that, I actually went against my usual criteria for being thoughtful and deliberate. And so over the intervening time, I've had the opportunity to learn a lot about that location. And the logistics around it, which particularly I think now in reflection don't make it as viable as I had originally thought it was. I have learned that the site where the car camp is, if a rest stop is located there, the car camp will close. I thought there was a compatibility there that I've since learned is not. I've also learned that finding an operator for that site has been a challenge. And that probably for me, the biggest concern is that I've also learned that there would be a significant financial impact on the Science Factory, which I thought was located far enough away, but apparently to many of the people who sign up for programs there, it's not considered far enough away. They run camp programs that actually take place in the entire grassy area in front of there. And it's not just an imagined financial impact. The director at the Science Factory has been informed by a number of parents, but also some schools who schedule field trips, that they will not go to the Science Factory for camp or other uses if there is a rest stop there. This in no way diminishes my interest in trying to find a viable rest stop. I still think that the desire to find a rest stop location is still very in my forefront, and I would really want to continue to work on it. But I want to focus on that specific location, and what I've learned in the last month is that what I initially proposed is not what I thought it was going to be. And so I think if I proposed it, I want to make the motion to take it back off the table because I no longer think it's a viable spot.
George?
Thank you, Mayor. Could you go over again about the rest stop being incompatible with the car campers that are already there? That's the first I've heard of that.
Actually, John has had a conversation with Terry McDonald from St. Vincent de Paul, and you might let him know what he told you.
When I talked with Terry, what he represented to me was that if the rest stop opened, that he would ask and relocate those campers that are currently car camping on the site. He just doesn't see that they're compatible, and I'm not an expert on that, so I don't know one way or another. That's what he represented to me.
Okay. Well, I guess this whole thing has kind of turned into a big mess, and I have to say that I'm a little puzzled, City Manager, at your decision to close Whoville, because I thought that the pretty clear direction from Council on February 18th was to not close it until sites were found, including rest stops and other providers, to accommodate all the people at Whoville. I mean, I'm looking through the transcript of that meeting, and I see that several counselors, including myself, that was our clear understanding that it would not be closed precipitously like this without everyone being taken care of, or as many people as could practically be taken care of, because maybe there would be some that wouldn't want to go to one of the possible other locations for whatever reason. I'd just like to maybe just hear what your reasoning for that decision was.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I agree with you. I think the intent was to try to provide a spot for those folks that were currently at Whoville to relocate to. The direction that the council actually gave was to begin closing the Whoville site not earlier than April 1st. That was the initial direction. And then subsequent to that conversation, the council talked about concern that that actually would take a number of weeks to accomplish. And so at that point, the council then directed us to close it not later than April 15th. The intent for that direction was not to lengthen the time that Whoville would stay open, but to ensure that it didn't stay open longer than necessary after April 1st. And so based on that, and the council also had opened up a rest stop at the Science Factory, which is still currently available. The intent that the council had with providing space, I think, was met in the sense that there was space available. An operator just didn't enter into an agreement with us to operate that. So.
Okay, but there's still a very good possibility that operator will enter into the agreement. Those conversations are stalled right now, I understand.
The last we have heard was an interest in not locating at the Science Factory, but I received just prior to this meeting a proposal from Michael Kerrigan from a coalition that would like to see a rest stop opened on Lot 9. That's it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, the Science Factory site is very problematic, but I think there's a way out of this and a way to move forward in a sensible manner. Things are kind of messed up now, but I think we can sort things out here fairly quickly and get moving forward on this in a positive way. The council, here's what we know so far. The council has approved 2 rest stops, neither one of which are set up. So-called rest stop number 3 over by Northwest Expressway, that site is available, but there's no operator for the site. And we know the operator of numbers 1 and 2 will not manage a site there in that location. Number 4 is kind of mired in controversy right now. I think for mostly good reasons. So I like the idea of finding 2 sites over near the BMX track, south of Leo Harris Parkway. I went over there this morning and drove all around, and there's plenty of good sites over there. You could easily accommodate 2 rest stops there, either in close proximity to each other, or they could be spread out however far council wanted to do it. There's open space over there that's not being used for anything right now. So I'll need another round.
So I've got Mike in the queue, but I wanted to say something. So council has authorized actually 4 rest stop sites. The first 2 are full and seem to be doing well. The second 2, as you indicated, have not been either hosted and have met with some opposition. My concern about jumping to site 8 or 9 or whatever it is, lot 9, 8 or 9, is that one of the things we've heard from people is you didn't vet it enough before you went to the Science Factory site and you need to talk to stakeholders, you need to understand what the level of opposition was going to be. And my belief is, from what I've heard from people, that it's not going to be any easier to locate something at the 8 than it is at has been at the last couple sites, and we don't even know that yet. So on my part, I would be reluctant to okay something that I don't have that any more information about, then that's a good idea. And secondly, I understand the issues around the Science Factory site. For my part, I would, if people need a temporary place to go, and that's authorized with some very careful managing, it could be a temporary site until we have another site. Otherwise, we would have no site, and we would have no place that we've really authorized for people to go to. So that's kind of the place you're stuck in between right now. I just want you to think about the implications of that. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll vote in favor of Chris's motion. It is entirely in line with everything that I said before we made the initial vote. And the only thing I would say, that concerns me, is we knew this. I mentioned during that conversation that I'd had conversations with that day people from Kesey Enterprises, people that work at the Cuthbert, people that are on the board of the Science Factory who had very large concerns with that decision. But the council ignored those in the initial vote. To a similar extent, here's a letter from folks at the university administration telling us that they have great concerns with the use of lots 8 or 9. So I agree with the mayor. Let's not rush into picking a place without having more in-depth conversations with the people involved, because we'll end up with a mistake. Thank you.
Further comments?
Doesn't do any good, but I do think it's really unfortunate that Whoville was closed before we had a solution. And I did vote against the Science Factory site. I've also, part of that motion was to close Whoville. I voted against the whole thing. I agree that we need to take time to think about what's an appropriate site, and things were going reasonably well. I think the city was not spending money. Other volunteers were doing it, and people were caring for themselves with the help of community members. And now it's just really unfortunate that we don't still have that spot that was working for people to use until we can decide on something else. But I have to agree that we shouldn't decide too quickly. I don't know where the people are going to be in the meantime. That's a problem.
George?
Thanks, ma'am. Well, I'll tell you where a lot of people are. They're where they were before Whoville was established. They're down by the river. They're back under the bushes. They're back under the bridge. They have no place to go. That's what's happened. We're back to status quo ante. And we moved way too fast on that, dismantling Whoville. But all is not lost. We can correct that, and we can get it back in on track and move it forward. I went to a meeting Monday night at First Christian Church. There were over 100 people there to listen to stories of the homeless. Some of the people that were actually all of the people that were displaced from Whoville, almost all of them, and to learn more about homelessness in general. The community support for Opportunity Village and Rest Stop number 1 and number 2 has been absolutely fantastic. And it will be for the other 2 rest stops that council has approved. We just need to find a spot. There will be shelters built. There will be shelter provided. There will be security arrangements. There will be oversight. And we know that because the other ones are working really well. I mean, I haven't heard of any serious problems at the 3 that are operating so far. There's no reason to suppose that problems will suddenly pop up with the next 2. So at some point next week, I'm going to make a motion, and it's going to read something like this. I move to establish 2 rest stops on the south side of Leo Harris Parkway at or in close vicinity to parking lots number 8 and 9. As soon as the city manager has signed a management and oversight agreement with the rest stop sponsors and exact locations have been approved by council. It's going to be something like that. I just wanted to give everyone a heads up today, and I wanted to give everyone a chance to drive by where I'm talking about. Go by Leo Harris Parkway. It's right across from Autzen Stadium. There are the parking lots, but there's also a big field, at least one big field that could work. And so between now and Monday, go by and do your own assessment. See what you think. I like it because it's open. Nothing's hidden. It's open. It's in full view. It's close to the bus stop on Martin Luther King. It's away from the science factory and Cuthbert and nearby nature. It satisfies some of those concerns. I don't really take the letter that we got from the university too seriously because I've never heard it a problem anywhere in the United States that homeless people are attacking or bothering students, on their way to class. I've never heard of that. I don't imagine that would be a problem here. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a real challenge. Again, I wasn't able to participate in the meeting where we set this location, and I'm not sure how I would have voted, quite frankly. I do think we should have a third rest stop, either at the current location that we've authorized or another. I could support the motion that Councilor Brown is previewing for us. I'm familiar with the spot that he's talking about. I actually frequent that area myself. And perhaps we might even consider designating a rest stop at the Broadway and Hilliard site. I think it's important for people to understand that rest stops are not Whoville. They are managed sites with rules, and the city manager has the authority to shut a rest stop down should it be found that the managers cannot maintain the order that's been expected of them. So it would not be a replication of Whoville at a spot within Alton Baker Park. And my understanding is right now we don't actually have anyone to manage the site that we've authorized at the Science Factory. Is that correct?
That's correct. We do not have an agreement with anybody for that
So
site.
as of today, there is no rest stop being created on that spot. So I understand there are people who are now dislocated and back in illegal camping situations, and that we'd like to have our rest stop program be available. But I'm also watching this whole situation in the last few weeks. And moving closer to the position I've heard Councilor Zelinka state in the past, that we need to let our pilot projects operate and evaluate whether or not they are a viable alternative to the other forms of emergency shelter that we might look at. I am becoming more and more convinced that this council is a policy-making body and that we need to be focused on that role and directing city resources towards policy-based solutions and not trying to provide on-the-ground tactical responses for which we are ill-equipped and for which we do not have the personnel or expertise. And that that's my analysis of part of this mess that Councilor Brown referred to. So we're in a tough spot. I think we're trying to do our best. I am conflicted about the motion to eliminate a rest stop when we don't have a third rest stop to propose. But I am grateful that the proposed rest stops are not being placed in my ward.
Okay, so Alan?
So first of all, I'd like to compliment staff on especially John and Chief Kearns and Joe Zaludek for taking what was a very potentially volatile circumstance and doing it without much incident and doing it well. So thank you for doing that. The Autzen site is problematic. It wasn't fully thought through. It wasn't fully vetted. I'm more inclined to do what we've done with other problematic sites, which is move on and find another site that is less problematic and that will have a host on it. I don't necessarily see the need to remove it from the list, but I think moving on is a good idea. But I don't think we should be rushing into this. I think it's very difficult to cite these, as we've all learned. And they need to be fully vetted with all the stakeholders and take some time to do that. And I think that's the lesson learned over the last couple of things. We're working our way through this stuff. Nobody's ever done anything like this before. And when you do get to do missteps and learn from them when you're breaking new ground. So I'm interested in getting on with the test of our pilots, the existing ones that we have, proving that sites like Opportunity Village and rest stops can work, can be safe, that they don't cause problems, that the fears that people have about them are not necessarily true, and that they can be good neighbors. And I think that's what the whole point of the pilots were, both Opportunity Village and the rest stops. Having said that, they need to be in the right place in order to do that. The Autzen site's not the right place. So, and that they are not like Whoville. They are, and if you go by the current ones, they're clearly not like Whoville. So they're smaller and have hosts and have rules about them. So, and they're sanctioned by the council. So, I'm interested in moving on and getting our pilots tested and letting the dust settle for a while.
Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, I'll support the initial motion. I don't want to lose track of where we are in that conversation, but I'll add to this by saying that I continue to advocate for the solution and the idea that I have advocated since the very first conversation we had on this issue, and that is that the city should fulfill the role it has the greatest strength to accomplish. We should spend most of our energy focused on the thing we can do best. And from my perspective, that's the exchange of information and the capacity for us to engage the rest of the community. I think that this is a compassionate community that would like to step up and assist with this problem and assist with the pain that people are dealing with if they only knew how to most effectively do that. And I think that the more we focus on being the exchange of information about where people can engage the process to help and where people might go to receive help, the more successful we'll be at actually solving the problem for real people. We've talked about that a lot, and I've been told by staff that we're working on that too, but I haven't heard back in the last many months on any kind of progress we're making with that, and I really would like to, because again, that's, in my opinion, that's where we can make a significant difference in helping people that need it.
Finish, Mike?
Yes, ma'am.
So this morning I sent this to somebody when we were trying to talk about some of these issues, and I just want to bring it up for all of you about how we could help with people's understanding of what rest stops are. And what I said was, I think it would help if we had a fact sheet for what a rest stop is and isn't that that can be shared. If an agreement is signed with a host, we should share those agreement contents so they are known and obvious. If a host does not show up, and I want to say this for everybody in the room, the agreement as we currently have with council is if a host doesn't show up, the rest stop does not open. That's the current agreement. Our agreement is not to find hosts. Our agreement is to say a host is required in order to open up a rest stop. We can describe what the other stops are like and how they function and offer the opportunity to visit. You can ask staff to put in place a protocol for how stakeholders will be informed in the future so that we don't keep making the same mistakes. We can admit that probably no one will step up and say, please put a homeless camp next to me. Rest stops are a different nature. We can put in place a contact for any concerns or complaints, and above all, as you heard earlier, the manager reserves the right to close a rest stop if it's not functioning well. Those are things that can create some certainty and some feeling of safety for people who we are asking to consider having a rest stop next to them. Those are just some thoughts I wanted to share with all of you to think about how to sort of smooth out this process and really make clear to people what a rest stop is and the kind of responsibilities we have for it or don't have for it. Anybody else? George.
Thanks, ma'am. Well, I'd just like to respond to Councilor Clark's last comments, and that, Council has stepped up, and this is what we did. We did what we're supposed to do. We provided direction, and we approved 4 rest stops and Opportunity Village, and the community stepped up big time. big time so far, and they're willing to step up again and keep this thing rolling. They've proven that already. They're willing to put in money, and they're willing to put in time, building Conestoga huts, setting up fences, delivering food. It's just been a tremendous response. And, you know, the established providers they're maxed out. We all know that. You know, there's waiting lists, year and a half, 2-year waiting lists at places for permanent housing. So we're on the right path. We've suffered a little hiccup here, but we have approved 2 other rest stops. We, the council, have approved that, and we need to get cracking and find 2 sites and get those going, because otherwise we're falling backwards. We're not moving forward right now. We're in limbo, falling backwards, and people are out and about, out in places where nobody really wants them to be, down by the river with no sanitation facilities, all around town with no sanitation facilities. We'll soon be getting complaints from neighborhoods about problems that are popping up that weren't popping up. However imperfect Whoville was, really I think you'll find there were fewer problems downtown and in the nearby neighborhoods and in Midtown. And so, you know, the sooner we get moving on this, the better. And I do like Councilor Surratt's idea of maybe that site for Whoville wasn't so bad. It just needs oversight, and it needs to be thinned out, like cut in half, and then maybe another rest stop established over, you know, near parking lot number 9 and all. Leo Harris Parkway, somewhere over there. I think that might be a good solution. So this conversation will continue, and we really need, you know, we can't put this off. We need to make some kind of a decision here real soon. Thank you.
Alan?
I think one of the things we learned from Whoville is that rest stops in commercial areas are probably not a compatible good way to move them forward. I think they get to be controversial, and they do have impacts. I wouldn't support another one in a commercial area like that, as heavily trafficked as that one is. The other thing that I think we all need to keep in mind is that we're not trying to solve the homeless issue here. There are approximately 1,700 homeless people in this area, and with Opportunity Village and the rest stops, we're providing a safe place for 75 of them. So that's the other 1,625 people that are homeless, a great many of which are vets and a great many of which are children, are still out in our community, either sleeping on couches or sleeping in their cars or illegally camping. And so the long term, and keeping the eye on the ball for the long term, is I think what's really important here, and that's trying to figure out a bunch of different solutions that can get us towards alleviating this problem. And as the mayor said, you know, the solution to homelessness is not let people get homeless in the first place, make them have housing. That's problematic from our standpoint. We don't have the kind of stock facilities to do single-family occupancy conversions into homes, and shelters are extremely expensive, and we're shy of capital for that. So we're trying to do a bunch of different things, and I think there's no silver bullet to solving homelessness. It's more like silver buckshot, where we're going to have a whole bunch of different solutions, and this is one of them. And I think we need to move on and let this play out for a while to prove the concept. I think it already is off to a great start with the existing rest stops and Opportunity Village. I think we just need to let them percolate for a while and let them prove themselves.
So on the table right now is Councilor Pryor's motion to close down or to remove the Autzen site. So I just reminding us that that's what we're going to vote on in a minute.
I just have one very short comment, Mayor. Thank you. Well, you know, Councilor Zelenka said something about being in a commercial zone, and I would point to R2D2 in Portland. They're right on Burnside. They're right at the Chinatown gate. It's a rest stop. I have not heard of any of Portland businesses downtown fleeing en masse because of...
Big time.
What? They have? Not because of R2D2.
Yeah, I heard a lot about that, actually.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps you could share that information via email. Well, there are other cities that where places are located in or near vicinity of commercial with not bad effect. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're ready to vote on Councilor Carter's motion. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4. In opposition, 1, 2, 3. It passes. So now be taken off the list. All right. I think that's been. Any other things that people want to share today? Yes.
This is items of interest from
Yes.
the council? Yeah. So I just had some happier things to talk about. The Washington Jefferson Skate Park opened unofficially on Friday, and it was a sea of people, all ages there, and it was a really great example of what we can do as a community when we come together and put our minds to a project like this. I'm very excited about it. It's in my ward, it's in my neighborhood, and I think it's really going to revitalize an underutilized park and bring some really positive energy to that area. There's, still some concerns watching 16-year-old kids passing cigarettes around between each other and that kind of thing. So there's some work we still have to do on that, but it was a very exciting time. And then the grand opening is Saturday, I believe it's June 21st, will be the official grand opening, but in the meantime, the skate park is open for business and getting highly utilized. I visited over the weekend, and it was still not nearly as crowded, but still very highly used. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was in our council packets, we received a report from a student project at the University of Oregon called the Green Alley Project, which actually focused on some alleys in Whitaker. In fact, an alley right across the street from my house that I use frequently. And I thought there was some really wonderful potential ideas in there that I'd like to, I've already spoken to the city manager about, and like to see if we could create a pilot project around some of these ideas of reclaiming some of our alley space and using them in a way to benefit the community. When I was canvassing door to door, when I was putting my name on the ballot to serve in this council, I talked with some folks who live in the apartments behind the Red Barn, and one of the things I heard consistently was, can you do anything about our alley and the potholes in our alley? And there's a lot of off-street parking behind many of those apartment buildings, and if people can utilize it by actually being able to drive up the alley into their parking space, we can alleviate some of the congestion on the street. So I think there's a lot of value in that project, and I was really pleased to see that in our packet and look forward to talking about that some more in the future.
Councilor Bowling.
Thank you. Yeah, two things. One, once again, I'd like to commend the Harlan Neighborhood Association as well as the people in the Harlan neighborhood. Prior to the spring break, they got together and put together meals for 76 students from Holt Elementary that qualify for the free lunches, and bagged up enough breakfast and lunches for the kids, those 76 kids, for the week of the spring break. This is becoming a regular thing with the Harlan neighbors. It shows that these folks really are care and are concerned about the kids as well as the parents and everybody else that live in the neighborhood. So congratulations and thank you again. The other thing is, has everybody had an opportunity to read the email from Jennifer Ye about the 955? Is there going to be a problem with moving that, the date of that work session?
I don't think so. I haven't talked to our staff if there's any concerns with that. I don't know if there's any legal concerns with moving it.
No concerns, but because the council by motion set it on a particular date, at some point the council, and it can be Monday, should make a motion to postpone it, and I know that Jennifer had a range of dates.
Right.
And so the council by motion could just reschedule it to,
No later than?
and if you pick, right.
Yeah. Can we take care of that now? It shouldn't take too long if I can just...
Sure.
I move that we postpone the work session on the Metro Plan Amendment for 955 Coburg Road to no later than May 21st, 2014.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Further discussion? All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. None in opposition.
Thank you.
Ellen?
I thought it was important to note two milestones that occurred while we were on break that I thought were rather significant. One was that, and these are at a national scale, one was that we finally made up all the jobs lost during the recession, regaining over 8 million jobs, and we're finally back to 2008. So we're kind of back down to ground zero, but it took 6 or 7 years to get there. So economy's still kind of slugging its way out, but we're finally back to where we were. And then the other one was that 7.1 million people signed up for health insurance, as well as several other million people got Medicare extensions. So substantially more people in our local community that actually have health insurance now and are covered than before. So I think those were two pretty significant milestones.
That, anybody else?
Oh, yes.
Yes,
I wanted to follow up on what Claire said. First, I thought that Ally study was a staff study, and I found out it wasn't, and then I thought, yeah, I remember now that seeing all the bumper stickers, free Jeff Lewis, and it's a real success story, not only a good study, but it's a success story for someone who was imprisoned a lot longer than he should have been, but has managed to finish school and do an outstanding job since then. And you probably all saw it in the Register Guard, a big story about the man, but great story. Thank you.
And at our last council meeting, we had a group of those folks who were working on the Green Alleys project actually show up and come and talk to us about it,
good.
too, at our community forum. And I think we all expressed some
It's a great project.
some real interest in it. But I'm going to end the meeting now. Thank you all very much.
Yes, Beth, who said